Okay, next up, I just mentioned one researcher with Monty. Next up is another one of our colleagues who has a primary research and teaching appointment, and that's Dr. Hanna Poffenbarger. Hanna really works in soil and nutrient cycling, soil carbon cycling, and she's doing a lot of work in the cover crop area right now as well. And so, Hanna, we appreciate you being part of our field day, and welcome to the program.
Thank you. All right, everybody can see my slideshow, okay? All righty. Well, thank you all for being here and tuning into the field day. I'm here with my graduate student, Sam Leuthold, and we're gonna talk today about a project we've been working on in collaboration with Ola Wendroth and also Matse Samran, who was just presenting. And the project relates to understanding and then trying to address and manage spatial variability in corn yield. So there's two types of variability, thinking about variability in corn yield. The first is temporal variability. That's just the variation that exists from one year to the next. And then there's the location variability or spatial variability. And so the year-to-year variation can be driven by overall trends in corn yields over time, which we generally see positive trends over time due to increased improved genetics and better management. But we can also see deviations from one year to the next just based on favorable or less favorable weather conditions. And then, of course, the location variation can be driven by management, how different fields are managed, but also soil and landscape properties that can affect resources that are available to the crop. And then these two, I've drawn these two circles as overlapping because we often see an interaction. So we see an interaction of landscape position and weather on corn yields. And so, for example, we can see in a dry year stress occurring on the slope, the upland positions where the corn might be more water limited. But then in a wet year, we may see lower yields in depressional areas where the crop is impacted by excessive water. And so because we can't predict weather very well in advance, it can pose some challenges because it's hard to predict then what the spatial pattern of the yields might be at the beginning of the season when it's time to plan out how you're going to manage the crop. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the processes behind this variation and then present some research results. So this is kind of a general hill slope diagram that soil scientists use. So we have at the top of the hill, the summit. That convex position is the shoulder that transitions into the back slope, the most sloping part of the hill slope, which transitions into this concave portion, the foot slope. And then the toe slope is the lowest elevation and low slope area in the hill slope. And so just based on studying a few hill slopes in Kentucky, I have some average properties we might expect. So you can see the elevation changing by about 7 feet going from the top of the hill to the back slope and then down to the toe slope. And in general, those summit and toe slope positions are lower slope, and then the back slope is the most sloping part. And so in a cropped field, obviously, there's a limit to how sloping it's really going to be. So this is sort of typical of the rolling cropland we might see in Kentucky. So one thing that can vary along the hill slope is the soil depth, and that relates to the rates of soil formation and erosion. So on the back slope, you tend to have the highest rates of erosion, and so there's not a lot of soil that generally accumulates there. So it may be shallow soil to the bedrock. In the hill slopes we were looking at, it actually got as shallow as about 8 inches on that back slope position. And then in the toe slope, you have the accumulation of topsoil that is moving downhill from the back slope area, and so you tend to have the deepest soil in the toe slope position. You can also see variation in soil moisture. So this was just some measurements from soil samples we had taken in the fall, and typically find that the toe slope is a little wetter than the upland positions, in part because the water after a rainfall event is running downhill and accumulating there, but also since it's lower in elevation, we may see a slightly shallower seasonally high water table, so closer to the surface. And finally, the organic matter levels can also vary, and we typically see that the toe slope, again, is going to be the most enriched in soil organic matter. Again, you have the accumulation of topsoil that can be eroding from uphill, which tends to be enriched in organic matter. And you can also have slightly slower decomposition taking place where you have a little bit wetter conditions on average. So in general, we tend to see that most soil resources are available at the bottom of the hill, which kind of makes sense, but also at the bottom of the hill, it's the area that's most prone to excessive water. So we wanted to do a study to look at these spatial patterns, if we can really expect to see the spatial patterns changing depending on weather from one year to the next here in Kentucky, or if they remain relatively consistent, and which would help with being able to manage according to that variability. And so we had 2 sites picked out, one in Glendale and one in Lexington, and we identified hill slopes within these fields. And so you can see here in the Lexington site, we had plots laid out in the summit, the back slope, and the toe slope, and that back slope is showing the highest slopes, as you might expect. And then in the Glendale field, we had actually 3 separate hill slopes, and that's what those small boxes represent. And these are some pictures of those sites. So in Lexington, you can see we laid out those plots within a grassed field. So there are some grass areas between the plots. But here we have the toe slope at the base of the hill, the back slope, and then the summit is behind where I was taking the photo. And then in Glendale, in this photo, we're looking uphill, toe slope, back slope, and summit. And you can see that there was some redistribution of crop residue that happened during a heavy rain. So there's another way that the toe slope can accumulate organic matter. But one of the other features of this study was not just the landscape position, but also the presence of a cereal rye cover crop, because we wanted to know if having that cover crop could help to reduce the spatial variability by helping to conserve water on the back slope and summit, where water can be more limiting due to the shallower depth, lower organic matter. And so here's a couple of photos from the studies during corn growth, and you can see in Lexington on that back slope position, the corn was looking more brown. And so right around this time of year, last year, we started to see a lot of stress showing up, a lot of water stress on the back slope. And then the Glendale site, you can see we did have some lighter green areas because embedded within this study were some different nitrogen rates. But we're going to talk today just about the adequate nitrogen treatments and really focus on the response of corn to the landscape position and cover crop. So at this point, I'm going to let Sam talk a little bit about some of the results that we've found.
Thanks, Hannah. Good morning, everybody. We'll start by looking at the data from the field trials in 2019. And as you can see from this figure, it's a year during which we had a little bit below average rainfall and above average temperatures. There are a few things that stand out. The first is that landscape position was a major driver of yield at both our Glendale and our Lexington sites. We saw that the toe slope areas down near the bottom of the hill yielded higher than both the sloping and the summit positions. At Glendale, the lowest yields were in the summit position, while at Lexington, they were in the back slope position. And when we look at our soil water storage, the total amount of water within the soil profile at our Lexington site, we can see that part of the reason why this back slope yields were so low. Throughout the growing season, there was significantly less water in the back slope position compared to the summit and the toe slope. And while we don't have the same data for our Glendale site, based on our observations throughout the season, it seems that landscape controls on soil water distribution played a major role in dictating yield there as well. And now when we look at the cover crop treatment at both sites, we see no significant difference between the rye cover crop and the winter fallow, although there is a trend towards lower yields following the cover crop in some of the landscape position. The landscape variability across our replicates and across these hill slopes was really high, and it may have drowned out a significant effect of the cover crop. But when we look at soil water storage at the different landscape positions and how the cover crop affected that, we see a small but significant increase in soil water following the cover crop compared to the fallow across all three of our landscape positions. And so with these observations, no significant effect of cover crop on yield, increased soil water under the cover crop, and significant variability between our landscape positions when we have average rainfall conditions. We asked this question of what are the effects of landscape position and cover crop under different kinds of weather? And to look into this, we divided the last 30 years of weather data into three categories based on rainfall: dry, average, and wet, and then compared yields between these categories. And so to do this, because we don't have a time machine, we took the data from our Lexington site in 2019 and used it to calibrate a dynamic crop model, the Decision Support System for Agro-Technology Transfer, or DSAT, and ran it under different weather scenarios from the last 30 years. The power of this tool is that we can put in all of these different inputs that we measure in the field, like soil texture and soil depth, and crop characteristics like time to anthesis or the number of kernels per ear, and our management activities. And after we get it running right, we can use it to look at things that we don't have the time or the ability to measure, like soil evaporation or soil drainage or daily nitrogen use by the crop. And so when we look across the 30 years of simulations, it becomes clear that two things overwhelmingly drive the majority of variability in this rolling hill field: weather and landscape position. And so what we're really seeing is that in our region, yield stability is primarily controlled by a combination of that year-to-year temporal variation. You can go to the next slide.
Oops.
No problem. That year-to-year temporal variation and that location-to-location spatial variation that Hannah mentioned in her first slide, but not the interaction between weather and landscape position that might be observed in a less well-drained soil, like something in central Iowa. And so when we look at these two factors separately, starting with landscape position, on average, across the 30 years of simulations, we see a yield penalty of 76 bushels per acre when we compare the back slope and the toe slope, a pattern similar to what we observed in 2019. And then when we look at the weather categories, we see that dry years are really where we're losing a lot of yield. Across the landscape positions, we see a 77 bushel decrease in yield when we're in the bottom third of that distribution of cumulative rainfall during the growing season. And so combining these factors now, we can see that the different landscape positions react differently to different weather conditions. The toe slope always yields the most, and the back slope always yields the least, no matter how much rain we got. But the biggest increases in yield with increasing precipitation were on the back slope. Even after the summit and toe slope became relatively stable with increasing rain, the backslope continued to yield more as we got more precipitation. And part of that is the limited soil water storage that we observed in our field trial. And when we look at how many years out of that 30-year period that different landscape positions experienced a yield loss greater than 10% due to water stress, we see that the backslope position was far and away much more sensitive to water stress than our other two landscape positions, experiencing water stress in 17 years out of the simulation, compared to 6 years in the summit and toe slope. So now moving to the cover crop aspect, similar to our field observations, the model showed no difference in yield between cover crop and fallow in 2019. However, when we look at the driest year of our simulations, highlighted in that red box, we saw a yield benefit from the cover crop, especially on the backslope position. In fact, we actually saw that the number of years that the backslope experienced a yield loss due to water stress decreased when that corn crop was following a rye cover crop. And so what seems to be happening is that having residue there from the cover crop during a dry corn season increases the surface roughness and makes it harder for water to run off from that sloping position. It decreases the likelihood that water will pool, and it increases the percolation down into deeper soil layers. And then it also decreases the soil temperature, which reduces the amount of water leaving the soil surface through evaporation. And all of these processes working in tandem allows for more water during the corn, or for the corn, during critical growth phases, like flowering and grain fill, and reduces water stress and that year-to-year variability. So overall, just to sum up, our model results indicate that the addition of a rye cover crop increased available soil water, making yields more consistent over time and space. And when we look at the distribution of yields across our landscape positions and our 30 years of weather in this plot here, we can see that the green curve, the cereal rye treatment, is narrower and less variable than the brown fallow treatment behind it, while having similar yields, those dashed lines, which are just 5 bushel difference. So.
All right, thank you. And I'll just wrap up this presentation with the takeaways. And that is that we found that the corn yield variability was driven primarily by landscape position and weather, but they didn't really interact. And so we always saw that the back slope was under yielding and the toe slope was yielding the highest among those 3 positions. So we saw pretty consistent spatial patterns from one year to the next. But that back slope was particularly sensitive to weather and rainfall. And then third, that cereal rye cover crop helped to decrease variability in yield by raising the corn yields in dry years, and especially on the back slope position. And so I just want to acknowledge the many different individuals who have helped with this research project, as well as our funding agencies, including the Kentucky Corn Growers Association. And we'll be glad to take questions if there are any.
So Hannah, I see a question in the chat from Carol Hinton asking about, is there a max or a minimum amount of cereal rye to plant in the cover crop?
So for this study, we used, I think it was about 65 pounds per acre. And that was working with our farmer cooperator who's used cover crops for many years and the rate that he has had success with. I think rye can be pretty flexible in that you could probably go a bit lower in the seeding rate and still achieve similar biomass levels, but obviously at some point, if you don't seed enough rye, you'll see a decline in biomass production. And then I think probably above about 65 pounds, you may obviously be just spending more on seed and not necessarily seeing that biomass increase. But I haven't looked specifically at different rye seeding rates. So we just went with kind of the recommendation from our farmer cooperator on that.
It seems like that 60-pound range is has shaken out to be the best rate in terms of a little bit of insurance against a lower stand for some reason if you don't get full emergence, and it's not overly thick if everything comes up as well. That seems to be about the rate that most people are using when it comes to cereal rye. So that's a good question. And just as the agronomist, I look at those numbers on the different slopes, really, really good numbers. And I think if we know that the slopes are going to be much drier more frequently year to year than the other landscape positions, it sort of makes sense that we cut back on seeding rate on those slopes because our yield potential is not as high. And we know that driving corn populations can affect, you have higher populations where you have better yield potential, and you might as well have a lower population where you have less yield potential. So at least that's something else for me to think about. I may need to incorporate some of that data into the next time we update seeding rates. So really, really good information.